the Overman Warrior Podcast.
Hi, Rich Hoffman here. So Cole Thomas Allen, age 31, from Torrance, California, tried to storm the security at the White House Correspondents' Dinner late April 2026. Tried to get in. Looks like he was trying to assassinate President Trump. If you've ever been to one of those kinds of things, the security pretty extensive, but there's usually rope barriers to keep everybody funneled into the areas where they check in, scan you. I was just at the White House. My wife and I were a few weeks ago from this date. So the White House security is always expected to be very tight. It's a lengthy process, and that's what they try to set up on an off-site thing. They do this down at on Connecticut Avenue, about a mile and a half, 2 miles down from the White House. So it's a little bit of a trip. It's inconvenient for the president to have to go there, and it just makes a case why you need the ballroom. And that was interesting that Trump's reaction to this shooter anyway, stormed the barricade. There were shots fired. He was trying to rush the security so they didn't have time to react, and hoped to get into the ballroom and get in close proximity to Trump before anybody could catch up to him. And it was obviously it all panned out. They caught the guy without shooting him. He was tackled and wrestled to the ground. He did the Cole Thomas Allen guy did shoot a Secret Service officer, hit him in the chest. It didn't have permanent damage. He was released from the hospital later. So all that turned out as good as it could have. But this is a strategy of storming the security line. And you have a few seconds to get to your target. And this is obviously a intention that this guy had. This person from California. He's a registered Democrat. Known to be a Democrat, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, this whole Democrat violence thing. Because the reaction to everybody afterwards was quite fascinating. But back to the proximity of the White House. Again, I was just there. I got this shirt from the White House just a couple of weeks ago. So I wanted to go see the ballroom, the construction, and I think this is a justification clearly for accelerating that process. And you're going to have events. You have to have big events always at the White House. It's the people's house. And you don't want to be driving all over town when you don't need to go to these events. And this correspondence dinner is usually at a hotel. I think it's the Hilton. And they do their best, and it's been pretty decent for years. But after the event was evacuated, there's video of reporters who were invited to this thing stealing bottles of wine and taking it home with them. Really, the low-life character of everybody involved was quite evident. And then there were the anti-Trumper people who wanted to say that it's Trump's fault that this guy wanted to attack him, that wanted to come assassinate him because of Trump's rhetoric, because he's always pushing everybody's buttons. So this attempt, and you saw this clearly with the Alex Jones case, where comments about Sandy Hook ended up having them destroy his life, sue him for an insurmountable amount of money, and essentially try to destroy his life every way they possibly could just for talking. It's a free speech argument. And they tried to make it that his free speech caused harm. Then you create a legal precedent that you can then prosecute later. The framing of this was everybody who's trying to kill President Trump is somehow at fault for making people upset. And then that is on him. And that's his fault. And that's what people actually said right after this dinner. And I found it very ironic. Of course, none of that's true. President Trump handled it well, wanted to go back in and have continue the dinner, which I totally agree with. It's a shame they had to get down on the ground and crawl off the stage in an embarrassing way. It's just ridiculous just because some loser wanted to come in there and kill him. And all these are Democrats. All these people, these would-be assassins, these people who plot and scheme are Democrats. And it's not just in the modern era. This is what everybody's missing. So again, on this trip, when we were, my wife and I were in D.C., and we were physically at the White House for a good several hours. After we left the White House, our whole day was kind of centered around the White House. After we left the White House, we wanted to go do a few other things in D.C., and one of the things my wife wanted to go see was the assassination place of President Lincoln. So I wanted to go down to the Ford's Theater. Ford's Theater is only a short distance, a few blocks down from the White House. So, and just a block up from Pennsylvania Avenue. It's down there by the FBI building and the Department of Justice and the Smithsonian. It's in that little sector there on 10th Street. And I talked to quite a few people who are very frequent visitors to Washington, D.C., and none of them had been there, which I find very, I mean, if you live in D.C., why wouldn't you go to the Ford's Theater? It seems like something that everybody would want to take a pilgrimage to go see. It actually, the day we were at the Ford's Theater, they were having a play. They still have plays there. They were doing 1776. But before the plays, they let you come in and do a historic tour. And I was actually at the box where President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And they have a great museum in the basement of the theater. Full museum. It talks all about the events that led up to and after the assassination of Lincoln. And it's highly significant because Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party was created to defeat slavery. And Lincoln, all he did was win a second term, won the Civil War against the South, who were Democrats essentially. And those who were against Lincoln were Democrats, just like this guy that tried to kill Trump the other day, or just at this White House Correspondents' Dinner. And that's, what other conclusion could you make at this point? He went there with a bunch of guns and stormed the security to get in, and he was apprehended. So he was stopped from his obvious intention. John Wilkes Booth behaved with the same kind of characteristics. And this is a Democrat thing. This is their notion of left-wing politics to drive the narrative through violence and pull the Overton window to the Marxist persuasions that were popular, have been popular since the mid-1800s and have moved into American politics. And every ground they've gained, they've defended with threats of violence. And Trump, all he's trying to do is make America great again. And those who don't want America to be great again want to stop him from doing that. And like this assassin, like this would-be assassin, and all the assassins who have been caught in the process. So this isn't a new thing. This is a Democrat thing. And it goes all the way back to Democrats being angry at Abraham Lincoln for winning the Civil War. What could Lincoln have done to not provoke violence from his opposition? Let them have their way? That's the assumption. And that's what the statements were towards Trump. Trump's stopping Iran from being terrorists in the world. Trump is stopping globalism with tariffs. Trump is pushing buttons and making people upset. So it's his fault if people want to kill him. That's the premise. And that's the same kind of thing that was said about Lincoln. And if you go to the Ford's Theater and you study the events of the day, and I bought a whole bunch of books, and they were good, surprisingly good. It was a surprisingly good museum. I expected you see the reenactments on documentaries about the Lincoln assassination, and you hear about the subsequent days when Booth broke his leg, jumping from the balcony where Lincoln was with his wife and some guests. After the shot occurred, Booth jumped down of the stage, said it was broke of his leg. He left through an entrance. He was an actor at that particular venue, and he had been critical of Lincoln. Lincoln knew it, but Lincoln wanted to celebrate re-election, winning the war. Lee had just surrendered, just a few days prior to that. And Lincoln was feeling pretty good, wanted to enjoy theater because he liked theater. So he and his wife went down to the Ford's Theater to watch the play. And Booth had been an actor in a lot of those plays and was definitely left-wing radicalized at the time, and was a major supporter of slavery, and did not like the Republican Party emerging to defeat slavery and defeat the South and win the Civil War. So Booth plotted his assassination, used his knowledge of the theater to get into Lincoln's private booth, and shot him in the back of the head, and then tried to escape. And then the manhunt was well known thereafter. It took a few days to catch up to him, but eventually Booth was captured and killed. And not much different than in the cases of these killers who have been trying to kill Trump. And this guy, this Cole Thomas Allen, did survive. So there'll be a lot more stories to come. But the intention to storm the security really isn't any different than when John Wilkes Booth did that at the Ford's Theater to kill Lincoln. And these are all Republicans being attacked by Democrats to prevent the political theater that is at play from people elected properly as a representative government and to enact policies that go against left-wing politics. And the answer from left-wing politics always is, when they can't win, violence. So that's the case here. Obviously, Democrats radicalize young people like this. I heard that he was involved in the teaching profession. I'm sure that all's come out in some degree or another, or whatever it is. A lot of early talk about it, but that's kind of irrelevant. He's a Democrat. He's this would-be assassin, and he was trying to do what Democrats typically do, a percentage of them. And that is, when they don't win their argument, they can't win elections, and they can't win with election fraud, they have to attack and destroy their opposition. It goes back to the Lincoln assassination and all these attempted assassinations of Trump. And here's the thing about that. What people don't know, and they should know, and I would recommend everybody who goes to D.C., go see all the other stuff. There's a lot of good stuff in D.C. to see. D.C.'s a good town. I really enjoy the town. With Trump in it, with Republicans in charge, Washington, D.C. is a great place. And I recommend going there and taking a pilgrimage and checking everything out. But how can you go to D.C., especially if you're going to the Capitol, you're going to the White House, you're going to the mall, you're going to the Smithsonian. How do you go to that area and not go to the Ford's Theater? And I was happy to find that the show does go on at that theater. They are still showing plays there. You can buy a ticket, go see a play. And it's quite a nice theater. And it's an extremely historic venue. You can't not be in the theater, not see the booth where Lincoln was assassinated. But what I didn't know, that it was still so active. I expected it to be preserved in some historic way. But I didn't expect to get that close to it and to get up and see it and have a presentation, which was really well done. They had an employee who works there, a member of the Historic Preservation Society, who was very passionate. They gave a nice half-hour, 45-minute explanation on stage of everything you need to know about the theater and John Wilkes Booth and President Lincoln at the time. So we spent a lot more time at the theater than I thought, because it was much more significant than I anticipated. And we certainly, my wife and I definitely geeked out on all the historical preservation. And again, I did get a lot of books, like I always do. And I was pleasantly surprised by how well the story was told, but also surprised more people didn't go there. And we're talking about people who work at the White House and people who work on Capitol Hill. I mean, if you're in D.C., you're living there, what do you do? I mean, why wouldn't you go to, especially if you're a Republican, why wouldn't you go to the Ford's Theater to see where the leader of the Republican Party, the creation of the Republican Party, was attempted to be snuffed out by Democrats after the victory of the Civil War at that theater? Pretty astonishing, actually. But across the street from the Ford's Theater. Really, all of 10th Avenue is dedicated from that little block, just up from Pennsylvania Avenue. So really, that street length of the entire city block is dedicated to Lincoln. Because across the street is the house where Lincoln then died, because after he was shot in the head, they took his body out of the theater, took him across the street to a bed, just to get him out of that scenario and somewhere somewhat safe. But he was shot with a large caliber bullet, and there was no way he was going to make it. So they put him in a comfortable bed, and he died slowly the next morning from the previous night where the attack happened. And across the street, you can actually go to where the bed is, where he laid. It's still set up the way it was that day. So we went over, my wife and I went over there, not expecting much to see. And actually, it was a whole museum and several buildings dedicated to it. On the outside, it looks as it did back then, just as the Ford Theater does. It looks as it did when Lincoln went there. But inside, they had done extensive remodeling, left the room that he died in as it was, left the waiting room where his wife sat through the night, waiting for something that, waiting for some knowledge of what was going to happen to her husband. It's pretty sad when you get to walk in their footsteps and you stand next to the bed where he died in, knowing what came after and the events that led up to it. It's pretty jarring. But then there's a building right next to that one, and these are like row houses, and they kept that one pretty much the way it had been. But then they knocked out the walls to the adjacent one, just to the south of the bedroom where Lincoln died, and they converted that into a full multi-story museum with elevators in it and everything. Very well done. And they knocked out the floors in unique ways and really did some unique, creative ways to tell the story of the Lincoln assassination and the Booth manhunt and the impact that Lincoln had on culture. And there's a stack of books, all the books ever written about Lincoln, that really went 3 stories tall, that they took the floor out and showcased it in a way that I had never seen before. It really puts in perspective how important Lincoln was, and what the assassination meant, and what really how America was defined by the creation of the Republican Party, the defeat of slavery, led by Republicans, led by Lincoln, and Democrats shot him for it. Because their party represents not everybody in the party, but they genuinely have a hatred movement anyway. They really want to move the Overton window with radicalism, protests, disputes, antagonisms, anti-American sentiment at all levels. And then there you have a handful of people like John Wilkes Booth or this guy, Thomas Allen. Pick your attempted assassin or assassin. Pick your Democrat, and you'll find that they have a large share of their people that are radicalized on their side because they can't win an argument, because they defend elements that are indefensible. They can't debate them, so they seek to shut down the voices who challenge them. And that's why this guy rushed, this Thomas Allen guy rushed the defenses, the security, hoping to get into the ballroom before anybody could stop him so he'd get a shot at Trump. And he was willing to die to do it, like a lot of these guys are. But the lesson is clearly, if you want to understand why these Democrats do these things, I would suggest going to the Ford Museum. As I was there, and this is the point of the whole matter, I was surprised because it's so glaring. The museum exhibit is so good, and you could spend an entire week at that museum and not learn everything. And I found myself, my wife and I found ourselves really relishing it because we like Lincoln anyway. We like the Republican Party for all the reasons that it stands for the anti-slavery position it took and created it, and the perpetuation of freedom that was a device that emerged out of the Constitution. Lincoln was a pivotal figure, just as Trump is. And I got very friendly with the people who work at the museums. I did tell the guy to put on the show what I thought of him, because he did a really good job. It was really well done. And I had an extensive conversation with him after, and then several other people who work at the museum as historic people who preserve history. And they noticed my intense interest, and it struck up conversations. And always with those conversations was the hush narrative of, we really can't talk about how violent Democrats are. We're here for everybody. We serve everybody. But the violence in the world is something that we're not allowed to talk about, even though the same thing that's happening to Lincoln is happening to Trump, or trying to happen to Trump. And it's an evil in the background that is persistent. And nobody's allowed to discuss it. And who decided nobody's allowed to discuss it? The Democrats? Because we were told we were supposed to, as conservatives, not to assault their feelings, not to hurt their feelings. And if we provoke them to violence, then it's on us. We're guilty of causing that problem. Now, I define all this. I'm going to talk about extensively because I just wrote a book about the subtleties of spiritual warfare behind these movements. And this isn't an early plug for the book. It's just to say, how can I make these assertions without having the receipts? I wrote a whole book about the receipts, and it will be coming out very soon. And I wrote the book because I get in these discussions with people, and they're like, but how can you know that? How can you say that? How can you define that? So I wrote a book to do so. And it will be out, and it will be the definitive explanation as to how there are conspirators who plot against God himself and God's creation, and political movements that want to preserve God's intentions as articulated in the biblical context. People like Lincoln. Lincoln loved his Bible. Trump has found a relationship with God in his political pursuits that he's emerged into quite nicely. But it's a byproduct of being a Republican and trying to preserve value and the kind of values that the human race deserves, as originally articulated in a biblical context. And then that is essentially what the Republican Party has come to mean. So I have answers, detailed answers in this upcoming book called The Politics of Heaven. And it does get into the spiritual nature of what possesses someone like John Wilkes Booth to go assassinate a president in cold blood and have that level of hatred. Or this kid, Thomas Allen, who came all the way to, how do you do that? Who came all the way from California to essentially assassinate the president at this White House Correspondents' Dinner. And went charged knowing what was going to happen to him. I don't think he planned to come out of there alive, obviously. And probably unfortunate for him that he is going to be alive. But he stormed the security barricade and wanted to get at the president with that kind of level of hatred that he premeditated it to a very maniacal effect, much like John Wilkes Booth did, and many others who have tried to assassinate presidents. It's always these Democrats that do this. You don't see Republicans going out and doing these things at all. It's Democrats that do it. And why? I think the answer you can see it on great display on 10th Street, just down from the White House, just up from the Capitol Hill, at the Ford Theater. It's a wonderfully preserved museum that deals with the psychology of assassination that is still very persistent today. And the employees there, everybody who goes there knows it, they see it, they feel it, but they don't feel they can talk about it because they don't want to set off the other side, because they don't want the Democrats to unleash violence on them. So they don't feel like they are allowed to discuss it. And it's pathetic. And we're not going to play that game anymore. We're going to discuss it. We're going to get it out in the open. We're going to deal with the subtext behind the subtext of the violence. And why do people like Thomas Allen feel that they have a right to enact violence on somebody they disagree with? That's got to stop. And it's not going to be some policy. You got to attack it at the spiritual level for which it resides, which is going to be the focus of all of our attention. But if you have to understand why this assassination attempt, what do you learn from it? You got to build the big, beautiful ballroom on the White House grounds and keep it under tight security, all these kinds of events. You don't want the president, all these people going all over town in unsecure locations, having these events because there's a lot of lowlifes that come to these events, as you saw after it was canceled, and all the media people were taking bottles of wine back to their rooms, figuring, oh well, I was at this free event, so here's a free bottle of wine, I'm going to get sloshed. The president was just assassinated, but we're going to go out there and make interviews, and he asked for it because he's out there poking everybody in the eye. And that's the same thing that Democrats said at the Civil War. If Lincoln would just mind his own business and leave those slaves alone, we want to have slavery. And he's poking us in the eye and taking away our way of life. That's the level of evil we're dealing with. And it's the Democrat Party that articulates it most. And they are evil in just about every level you can really base it on. And I'll prove that in great detail, not because you want to have a partisan conversation about Democrats, but because they deserve it, because of the long history, just like we've seen in this Thomas Allen character. I'd say there's a lot of demons whispering in his ear, but he makes himself vulnerable through radicalized hatred that is part of the Democrat Party that makes them very dangerous. And that's why ultimately you have to have, if you're going to have events like this, you have to have a ballroom on the White House grounds that is under tight security where these kinds of things can't happen. So I think we accelerate the building process of the big, beautiful ballroom, and the future will be much better when we have these events, because there's always going to be radical Democrats like this kid out there trying to stop Republicans from doing the good work of preserving the human race for the perpetuation of God's wishes. And we need to align ourselves to those things. Anyway, Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe. Make tomorrow a better day. If you haven't read my book, The Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. And we have to deal with these things for the honesty for which they did. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening.
Coming soon, the politics of heaven in 2027. A treasure hunt through heaven and all human history.